Hello, dear guests. Today we have an interesting seminar with one of the champions on women's health, Judy Norsigian. And she is visiting Armenia every 1 or 2 years. And every time she comes back, she's ready to serve the community, to share her expertise with Armenian women, and her partner usually shares his expertise and experience with Armenian men and boys on how to fight against violence, which is very nice. So thank you for your generosity, for contributing to our students and AUA community and Armenian community in general, educating our members. Today's discussion is going to be on challenges in women's health and advocating for change. I would like to say a few words about Judy Norsigian, who was a founding member of Our Bodies, Ourselves in 1971. She served as the executive director from 2001 to 2015 and currently chairs the board of this organization, best known for the landmark publication Our Bodies, Ourselves. She co-authored all 8 editions of this book, named by the US Library of Congress as one of 88 books that shaped America. She was also a member of the editorial teams that produced Our Bodies, Ourselves, Menopause and Our Bodies, Ourselves, Pregnancy and Birth, OBOS, seeks to advance the health and human rights of women and girls globally. Judy has appeared on hundreds of television and radio programs, including NBC, Nightly News, Al Jazeera, The Today Show, Good Morning America, The Early Show, Oprah, Fox News, and The Current. She served on the board of the National Women's Health Network and Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research. Currently, she serves on the board of Community Works, which supports Boston area social justice organizations through payroll deduction, charitable giving programs. She is a former board member of IWA, the Armenian International Women's Association, and continues to volunteer for this organization. Her personal recognitions include the Public Service Award from the Massachusetts Public Health Association, the Radelife College Alumni Association Annual Recognition Award, and the Massachusetts Health Council Award. She was also named one of 21 leaders for the 21st century by Women's E-News and holds honorary doctorate from Boston University and Simmons College. Judy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you all today. I bring greetings from Our Bodies, Ourselves, which first started as a group called the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. It grew out of a conference in 1969 back in Boston at the early days of the women's liberation movement, and it is going to be celebrating our 50th anniversary in the very near future. I'm going to start with going through some slides that give you a sense of the scope of the work, and then I'm going to get into some of the few topics I plan to address in some depth, and then a couple of topics that I will lead you to resources on. This PowerPoint will be available at an AUA website. I'm not sure exactly where, but you'll all find out about it. And there's also a little sign-up sheet here. If you'd like to receive any information about a specific topic, you can leave your email and get in touch later. So the organization, although it started in the United States, didn't take many years to become global. This is the first 1971 edition. It was in newsprint paper, not a real cover. It was published by the New England Free Press, This is the book in 2011, the last print edition that we did, and the 40th anniversary of the book's existence. And that is down here on the stage if you'd like to take a look at it. It's here at the AUA Library. Next to it is the second Armenian edition that was produced by Dr. Mary Khachikian. She's now based at St. Mary's Health Center, which is in the North Marash district, and she's been doing some amazing work around sexual and reproductive health, particularly for young people. I have one of their newsletter magazines with me if you'd like to take a look at it afterwards. This is, a print book only goes so far. It's really important to have information on the web, and so we have a very extensive website as well. These are two single topic books that we did, one on menopause and one on pregnancy and birth. And we are now in discussion with Dr. Khachikian and some other colleagues here to produce an Armenian resource completely online to address the perimenopause. It's important to remember that menopause is not just one point in our lives. It's really a period in our life, and we have to address all of the issues that start before we're actually through with menopause. So maybe that will be a project that will come to fruition soon. I'm just going to give you a few sample translation adaptation projects of the book. Women's groups around the world have used different formats. They've got technical assistance from Our Bodies, Our Cells staff, and they have produced more than 30 such projects. This is what came out of Japan. This is what came out of China. This is the Serbian edition, which came out very shortly after the horrible conflict there, and this is a picture on the cover from their first Take Back the Night march that women in Belgrade actually held. This is the French African edition, which was produced in Senegal, the Korean edition, Russian edition, which is completely online. There is no print book, but so if you know anyone who speaks Russian, this is a good resource. It's somewhat out of date. This is the Bangla edition. This is the Armenian edition, and this is a very interesting project where Palestinian and Jewish Israeli women based in East Jerusalem prepared materials in both Arabic and Hebrew, and that is online. At least much of it is. The Arabic language version is. The Hebrew book is a hard copy edition, and the publisher did not give permission for it all to be online. This is our colleague group in Istanbul, Mavi Kalam. They have had, as you might imagine, women's groups in Turkey have had major challenges recently, and they are fighting for their lives, literally, at the moment. And so this project is not done. The book is not done, but they have materials online, and they have actually participated. One of their members came to the AWA conference here a few years back and met Dr. Mary Khachikian and talked about potential collaboration. And this is the Spanish language edition, which was produced in the United States. One of the most recent projects was produced in Vietnam, and 3 different booklets, 3 volumes. And this is a statement that the creators of the Vietnamese booklets sent to us, that they shared with their funders. One of them was the Ford Foundation. Why Our Bodies, Our Cells? And they said it's not just a book, it's a philosophy of life. Your body is yourself. Only you have rights on your body. This is their language, not ours. Of course, that's their dream. Right now, that is not the reality. You love your body, you respect yourself, and be active in exploring and caring for your body. They are pursuing this work in Vietnam in very, very innovative and creative ways. These are just some of the challenges our global partners have taken on. It's not a focus for today's conversation, but at our website you could read much more about what we and other groups have been doing in these arenas. The increasing sexualization of women and young girls, and the role played by the media, more intensive and sweeping attacks on reproductive rights and justice, and violence against women and girls, including sex trafficking, which I do know is a problem here in Armenia and this whole region. I actually think that the first item here, which is the increasing sexualization of women and girls, and also the depiction of sexual violence in media, television, radio, many venues in our lives today, is a much more serious problem than many other things that people are identifying as social problems. So these are what we were going to talk about today. First, a little bit about HPV infections, human papillomavirus infections, and the so-called HPV vaccine. We're going to talk a little bit about the increasing demand for women as gestational mothers and the growth of transnational commercial surrogacy. This also includes an expanding market for women's eggs. In order to do so-called IVF, in vitro fertilization, you often need donor eggs. And where do these eggs come from? Well, they come from young women who undergo fairly intensive multiple egg extraction procedures, which we will discuss shortly. I want to talk briefly about improving maternal and child health outcomes, and then the environmental impacts on reproductive health. This is a huge issue, and it's a huge issue everywhere in the world. So first, human papillomaviral infections, so-called HPV, and it's the most common sexually transmitted virus in the United States. In Armenia, about 1.4 million women are at risk of developing HPV infections, where cervical cancer is the second most common cancer among women 15 to 44 years of age. Now, cervical cancer is not the only possible outcome from an HPV infection. You can have genital warts, you can have other kinds of cancers, but this is a primary concern for us. 90% of HPV infections resolve on their own. They go away, but some do progress to cervical cancer. In 2012, it was estimated that about 272 new cervical cancer cases were diagnosed in Armenia, and that 112 women died from cervical cancer that year. In the US, there are about 13,000 cases a year and more than 4,000 deaths a year from cervical cancer. Now, these figures are actually larger than what were projected a few years ago. We thought the cervical cancer deaths would be more likely around 3,000. Well, they are above 4,000 per year. The HPV Center, the link here on this slide, will give you a huge report on the issue of HPV infections in Armenia in particular. So there are about 100 types of HPV, only 13 of which are known to be cancer-causing. For example, 16, 18, 31, 33, 45, they've named a number for every type. HPV is spread only through intimate skin-to-skin contact, primarily vaginal or anal sex. So it is not what we would call highly contagious if you need that kind of very intimate contact. There are now 2 HPV vaccines that protect against HPV. And one is Gardasil and one is Cervarix. One new vaccine, Gardasil 9, protects against 9 types of HPV. That's produced by Merck. And overall, these vaccines have the potential to prevent 70 to 90% of cervical cancers. The first Gardasil product from Merck had protected against 4 of these HPV types, and Cervarix protected against 2. So they weren't as protective as one would like. The Gardasil 9 actually protects against more types. And one of the things that's often not pointed out is that the vaccine is for boys and men as well as for girls. But you need to intervene and use the vaccine at an early age, because once you've had sexual activity, the vaccine is far less effective, which is why they are trying to target girls before they are sexually active. That, as you can immediately think and surmise, is a problem in most cultures. Like, why would you be inviting young girls to have a vaccine before they're sexually active? Isn't that like inviting them to be sexually active? That is a cultural problem we have. Unfortunately, public health activists around the world are still working on it. To get a vaccination before you ever would need it, and you will need it when you have sexual contact, is a hard thing to understand. It doesn't give someone permission and license and to go out and have sex that day, but it protects them for the time when they will have sex. And your first sexual encounter, you may have the vaccine when you're 13 or 14 or 15. Maybe you don't have a sexual encounter till you're 18, 19, 20. When you're married, who knows? But your partner could infect you with one of the HPV types that could lead to cervical cancer if you didn't get the vaccine. So it's an important development scientifically, and it's the first vaccine for a cancer that we've developed in the world that is successful. Not completely successful, as we'll point out. The Centers for Disease Control in the US now recommend the HPV vaccine for young women through age 26 and young men through age 21. It's also recommended for the following if you did not get vaccinated when you were younger. Young men who have sex with men, including young men who identify as gay or bisexual or who intend to have sex with men through age 26, young adults through age 26 who are transgender, and young adults through age 26 with certain immunocompromising conditions, including HIV. Arguments against isolated HPV vaccine mandates. And what I mean by this is if a country or a state and within a country comes along and says every child must get a vaccine in this community before, and this vaccine, before they can be allowed into school this year. This was actually promoted by Merck for a few years in the United States, a terrible idea, and most of these mandates were rescinded later. You do not ever want to mandate a vaccine without public education first, so the public understands what it's about, especially a vaccine that's so closely associated with sexual activity. First of all, this is not a crisis where we have a highly contagious disease, where you need to create what we call herd immunity, where everyone should get vaccinated because the potential for transmitting that disease is so high. It's not high with HPV. And giving girls and boys this vaccine does confer, in some cases, a false sense of protection from sexually transmitted infections. Just because you get this vaccine doesn't mean you're completely protected, which is why women need to remember there are barrier methods of contraception. You need to remember that you need to protect yourself from other sexually transmissible infections as well. And the HPV vaccine does not do that. So one shouldn't think that you get protection from all sexually transmissible infections. And any HPV vaccine program should be part of a well-planned cervical cancer prevention plan that includes Pap tests. HPV vaccines do not yet protect, as I said, against all types of cancer causing HPV, so you need continued cervical cancer screening. When you get a Pap test, you see abnormal cells at a very early stage, and you can treat those cells and avoid the development of full-blown cervical cancer. So Pap tests are very important. And actually in Armenia, years ago, there was much more universal Pap tests available, and your cervical cancer rate was lower. It got higher as Pap tests became more and more difficult to obtain. And now I think you're trying to reverse that trend by making Pap tests more widely available and also by promoting the HPV vaccine. I know there's a program that is providing it for free at the moment through Gavi, the Global Something Vaccine Initiative. Can't remember what the A stands for. More reading about the opposition to the HPV vaccine in Armenia is well described here, and I really encourage you to read it. It discusses the use among girls and young women, but it really would be great to have a conversation including boys and young men in this country. And I think this is a great topic for an AUA student to take on. Now I'm going to move on to global commercial surrogacy. This is a fast-growing, multi-billion-dollar market that is largely unregulated and exposes many women to significant harms. We, along with our colleagues, have created a website that is independent called surrogacy360.org, commercial-free, and it provides factual information and resources on surrogacy for particularly geared to what we call commissioning or intended parents. It explores the health, legal, and ethical issues related to international or global commercial surrogacy. And we address some of the former and emerging hubs such as India, Nepal, Mexico, and Southeast Asia. There are cards for Surrogacy 360 up here in the front. Help yourself to these cards, which includes the website and a little more information. Our colleague, the Center for Genetics and Society, is going to be taking over the further development of this website. We will be continuing to work with them, but they will be the lead organization, and they will be getting multi-year funding from the Open Society Foundations. What we're trying to do is counter industry-sponsored information, much of which is easily available online, which is misleading women of all ages about what we do and don't know regarding surrogacy and IVF, and in particular egg provision. By engaging those involved in the demand side of such arrangements, these intended parents, and raising their awareness about motivations, living conditions, and the health and human rights of gestational mothers, we hope that more intended parents will critique closely those agencies that facilitate commercial surrogacy agreements that they partake in. This is the screenshot from surrogacy360.org. These are selected health risks that the website discusses in more detail. Hormone treatments for artificially preparing gestational mothers to carry embryos, mandatory and medically unnecessary cesarean sections. This was a huge problem in India, where they even had proposed legislation that would have required the gestational mothers to undergo cesarean section for every birth that would result from these gestational surrogacy arrangements. This makes no sense medically. It's bad for the baby. It's bad for the mother. It was only for the convenience of the clinics and the intended parents, who were often coming in from other countries. Mind you, India has banned commercial surrogacy as of a year ago. Before that, they banned international participants. People from Europe, from Israel, from the United States could no longer come to India and hire a gestational mother there. Then they saw the problem continued with Indians who sought out gestational mothers. And right now, India has a program whereby only altruistic arrangements are allowed, similar to what we have in Canada and in Australia. Multiple embryos are implanted to increase success rates. As we all know, when you implant more than one embryo in a woman, you increase the risks for both the baby and the mother. We do not want to see multiple births as much as we can avoid them. So it's better to have single embryos implanted, and that is becoming a best practice in the United States now. Not all clinics are following it, but it is a best practice. It also increases prematurity, low birth weight for the babies born, and increases risks of hypertension, preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and postpartum hemorrhage for the mothers. So we are now working with our colleagues around the world. There are many academics and scholars working on this as well, to create a call to action to get surrogacy providers to adhere to the recommended cap on embryo transfers, to get them to adopt vaginal birth as a standard of care, to guarantee freedom of movement, access to community and agency in decisions. In India, for example, women were put in these maternal homes, and for 9 months they basically couldn't see their families, they couldn't see their children, their movement was restricted, they couldn't even walk in the community very much. So they were mostly holed up in these maternity homes, not a healthy way to be pregnant and give birth to begin with. Surrogacy providers should also offer postpartum and longer-term support in recovery and adjustment. They must obtain informed consent. And other changes. As you can imagine, for many women, even though they've had their children already, and they do understand they're giving up these children after they give birth to them, once they give birth, they have very strong, powerful maternal feelings about the baby they just gave birth to. And very often it is difficult to part with that baby. And these surrogacy agencies should be providing some sort of counseling and support for the gestational mothers after they surrender the child to the commissioning parents. Our Indian calling, Sama Resource Group for Women in Health, which is based in India, it's based in New Delhi, created a 43-minute film, which I will bring a copy next time I come and leave in the library. It's excellent. Eventually they will make it available online. And this explores commercial surrogacy in India, and primarily through the eyes and experiences of the gestational mothers. It's not as relevant now, but it's relevant because this practice is now expanding to other places like Vietnam and in Nepal, where they're considering banning legislation as well. And I'm leaving the link in here for this very interesting article that is talking about women as biocitizens. You know, young, white South African women are now heading overseas to donate their eggs to infertile couples and receiving a free international holiday in the process. They have very little information about what multiple egg extraction means, unfortunately, and the informed consent is pretty much non-existent. So what are a few of these risks for so-called egg donors? We call them egg providers because they're almost always not donating eggs, they're selling eggs, but the industry does not want to label it that way. And despite the fact we have no good longitudinal data regarding the health risks for young women who undergo multiple egg extraction, many young women in the US believe these procedures to be well studied and safe. Young women who undergo egg extraction for the purpose of freezing their eggs and using them later for themselves also face similar risks. We have so many reports now, all of them anecdotal, of younger women. They've been in medical school, graduate school, they're in their 30s now trying to get pregnant, and they're having problems. And a few of them have gone to the infertility clinics, and the fertility clinics tell them, oh, we've been meeting a lot of women like you who were former egg donors. Don't worry, we can help you. Well, it's not something that a lot of young women expected, nor would they have so freely gone ahead and provided their eggs for pay if they understood some of these risks. Currently, there's only one voluntary registry based at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center in New Hampshire, now tracking the health of these young women. But because it's voluntary, because there isn't mass promotion about the availability of this voluntary registry, not that many women are participating. Here's the website, and here's a screenshot from the IVF registry. We happen to know the woman who runs it. She's a faculty member at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center and the medical school there. These are some of the ads you see in the United States. They're usually on college campuses, telling women, become an egg donor, earn up to $10,000 per cycle. They tell you how much money you'll get. Usually it's anywhere between $7,000 to $10,000 these days. But there are ads that ask for specific characteristics, your SAT scores, your athletic, you have, this and this, or your Korean descent. We've seen ads that provide $80,000 or $100,000 to the right donor, so-called donor. You're getting paid. This is our response, and we've been trying to place this ad into some of the college campus newspapers. Are you considering egg donation? Have you asked? Did you know? Have you been told the long-term fertility and health risks to egg donors have not been adequately studied and they're poorly understood? And so then we give the link to the Infertility Family Research Registry and Our Bodies Ourselves, and also another website to a group called We Are Egg Donors. These are women who provided their eggs earlier. One or two of them are lawyers now, and they've formed a group and they have a website that is tracking the experiences of egg donors. And they have collected data which they plan to publish in the near future. And we are in good touch with them, and one of their videos is actually at our website. You could link to it and see it. I like to use this slide because it is one of the precautionary principles in public health. How many of you have heard of that? So if you've been in the School of Public Health, you probably have seen a slide that shows you all the 4 precautionary principles of public health and the international group that developed them, how important it is. It's very critical that we think about applying these principles everywhere we can, especially in an age of escalating commercialism in all sectors of our lives, where it's the profit motive that dominates, not the well-being of individual citizens. And this is one of my favorite precautionary principles, that absence of evidence of harm is not the same as proof of safety. We see this with silicone gel breast implants in the United States. We see it with some of the drugs, where there wasn't sufficient pre-marketing approval study. It sometimes came later, but the information was not gotten out to the public. So the public thinks that because something is approved or practiced or done, that it must be safe. We had these mesh procedures for women experiencing prolapse midlife, later in life. These were horrible medical devices. They've since been taken off the market, but many women were mutilated when they got these, they used these vaginal mesh products and with surgical procedures, not good oversight. So in the case of providing eggs, young women have to understand that we do not have proof of safety. What we have is a lot of absence of evidence of harm because we haven't done the longitudinal studies. There's certainly anecdotal evidence of harm. Lots of stories reported, but that's not the same. And what we want are good data. Now I'm going to move on to talk briefly about reproductive health and the environment. I don't have enough time to speak in depth, but I thought the best way to address this topic is to tell you about something that happened almost 3 years ago at Northeastern University, where scholars, advocacy leaders, government agency representatives, and community-based organizations who are working to understand the environment's role in reproductive health and to advocate for men, women, and children who are affected by environmental contamination, came together and shared their wisdom, their experience, and the data. And the link to this conference, was a day-long conference, is right here. And I'm going to just mention a few highlights. A group of Brandeis University students, these were undergraduates, wanted to get a deeper understanding of exposures in Black women's hair salons. So what they did is they worked with the Resilient Sisterhood Project, Clean Water Action, Silent Spring Institute, and other partners to conduct a study to assess hair salon workers' exposure in the greater Boston area, and specifically to volatile organic compounds and fine particulate matter. These students presented their findings and their recommendations, and you can be sure that, not surprisingly, the blood levels of some of these volatile compounds were higher in these workers than they would be in the general public. Whether or not that proposed a minor or a huge risk to the health and well-being is still something being studied. Julia Brody, the executive director of the Silent Spring Institute, spoke about endocrine disrupting compounds. As you probably know, there are many chemicals in the environment now that behave like estrogens. We call them xenoestrogens because they're foreign. They come into the human body and they lock into estrogen receptor cells. Studying endocrine disrupting compounds is so important. I think you have a book here by Theo Colburn, a very famous scientist who died about a year or two ago, called Our Stolen Future. She is one of the first scientists to call attention to these estrogen-like compounds in the environment that affected human health, particularly reproductive health of men and women. And it's also a concern for breast cancer, a huge concern. So Julia Brody has been instrumental in starting the household exposure study. You can learn more about it here. To identify major sources of women's exposure to EDCs, these synthetic chemicals that both mimic and disrupt hormones. And they were looking at 100 target compounds, and it was the first to comprehensively show that consumer products used at home are a major source of EDCs. And their research was also used to show that high levels of flame retardants in California were a problem, and that led to changes in the state's flammability standard for a future foam. As you can see, there's a typo there. That was a huge struggle in California. They have since addressed this, and I think their legislation that is limiting the use of these flame retardants is now in place, but the labeling is required at the very least. That got into place a few years ago. The huge impact on children is something that has worried so many of us, less so on adults. And I might tell you that there's a fascinating story here which addresses how the tobacco industry tried to blame people who fell asleep with their cigarettes lit as the major problem, and therefore we needed flame retardants. Actually, that's a total myth. It's a sham. It's a collusion between the flame retardant folks and the tobacco industry that led to the requirement of using these very harmful flame retardants and things like clothing and furniture, and it's taking us years to get them out of these products. So another speaker who is a professor at American Studies at Brown University, she has a recent book called The River is in Us, Fighting Toxins in a Mohawk Community, and exploring how these indigenous Akwesasne folks have created a grassroots effort to fight contamination of its lands and reclaim its health and future. Other presenters were Dr. Laura Vandenberg, Associate Professor of Graduate and Graduate Program Director at the University of Massachusetts Amherst School of Public Health and Health Sciences. You should get her to speak here. She is phenomenal. She served on a number of U.S. and international expert panels to address endocrine disrupting chemicals, which was the topic of her presentation. Again, you can link to it and hear her in more depth. I also gave a talk there as well, focusing on a few of the issues that are of relevance around women, reproduction, and environmental exposures. I just want to say something else before I move on, which is that I brought with me a copy of The Nation, which I finished in the plane, and this particular issue is about Governor Jerry Brown, who is the governor of California, which is, some of you may know, is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's a huge economy, and it's one of the reasons why, despite a terrible president and someone who's trying to destroy all the environmental protections we've been working on for several decades, California has resisted this because they have lots of money, lots of power, and they basically can go like this to the federal government in many ways. So Jerry Brown, as governor, has been overseeing some important improvements, but this article is critiquing him on not going far enough with respect to the fossil fuel industry. So any of you interested in that, I will happily leave this copy of The Nation with you. It's also probably online. The other thing I want to mention, I'll come up with in a minute, has to do with mothers out front. This is the other topic I wanted to talk about. You have made some progress here in Armenia in improving maternal and child health outcomes. So I don't see it as one of your top priorities. I think of environmental health exposures and even around maternal and child health as really much more significant. But those of you interested in seeing whether or not in Armenia you are following best practices, I refer you to an incredible report that just came out with the National Partnership for Women and Families from June 2018. This blueprint has done a review of what we call the best data, the best practices, not just in the United States, but in Europe and in Canada, to come up with recommendations. And so they address the maternity care workforce, they address the importance of using interventions judiciously. As we know, many of the drugs and procedures we've used have a downside as well as a positive side. Overuse of cesarean section is one of our biggest problems in the United States. After your first cesarean section, with each subsequent one, you introduce the likelihood of one of the most serious types of consequences later with a cesarean that might follow again, like placenta accreta, conditions that actually are life-threatening. So we are pushing for much more judicious use of cesarean section when it's needed, certainly not planning cesarean sections. And I refer you to this. It also points out and reinforces the importance of breastfeeding, even when a woman has had a traumatic birth, even when she's had a cesarean section. Our hospitals are using breast shields. We're using all kinds of techniques, rooming in to try to ensure that a baby born after a cesarean section is only breastfed, because the data show that breastfed babies after a cesarean section do much better. And I know that you've had a real challenge here, because after the earthquake, when we needed all that infant formula, and it came in and everybody's used it, it was very hard to switch back to an idea that the best way to feed your baby is through mother's milk, through breastfeeding. But that actually has to happen here, because one of the most important predictors of good health for a baby is being breastfed exclusively in those first few months of life. So I'm going to close with just a few slides. This is one of my favorite films about the early women's movement in the United States between like 1968, 69 and the early 1970s. Mary Dorr, the filmmaker, has shown this around the world. She's won film festival awards everywhere. There are sections in here that feature Our Bodies, Our Cells, so you might enjoy that. There's also a section that features interviews with women who attended our 40th anniversary symposium back in 2011 at Boston University. You can get this on Netflix and online, and if anyone wanted to get together, I have an account, can show it for free, even in the next few days. It's a remarkable movie, and it's full of humor. One of the things that men and women are so surprised about on college campuses is just how funny. I mean, women were angry, and women did come together to deal with all kinds of things like reproductive rights and violence against women, but there was a sense of humor in this movement that often one forgets about. This is a book. I always include this book in every talk I give, because all of us care about world peace. All of us care about less fighting, both within countries and between countries. And one of the things that surprised me a few years ago was to look at this well-researched book that documents how the extent of violence committed against females in any country is the major determinant of whether or not that country is violent within itself or more willing to use military violence against those in other countries. It's an indicator more important than poverty, natural resources, or the degree of democracy. That is something most of us would not believe. But they used World Bank data, they used other international data to make the point that this is such an important factor in any given country. And it's why the fight to stop violence against women is so important. It's about so many issues, and it certainly is about world peace. This is why I do what I do. I have a grandson, his name is Zola. There's his dad, who is really important, and his care. That's actually in the hospital right after the birth. They tried to have a home birth, but they had to have a transfer. And there's my daughter with Zola. And it's the only bad part about being here is that I miss him. And I think about babies like Zola whenever I do my environmental activism. And the work I do is through a group called Mothers Out Front. It's based in the United States, but they're beginning to have chapters everywhere else. And they are working for what we call climate justice. And all we do, we keep our mission of a livable climate for all children at the center of our work. We lift the voices of those who care for and nurture children so that we are heeded by those in power. We focus resources particularly in those communities who suffer the injustices of climate change and fossil fuel use today and have been historically marginalized. And I invite you to look at the website for Mothers Out Front to think about ways in which women and others, men participate in Mothers Out Front actions, might join together to improve the environment here for all the families of Armenia. So with that, I'm going to stop so we have a little time for discussion. Let me check the, oh good, we're doing just fine. You do not need to talk about something I addressed. You can talk about any other women's health issue that interests you, but if you would like, ask questions about these topics, about anything else that's on your mind. So it's your turn now. Oh, and I think what I'm going to do is...
Please use the microphone.
Yes. This one? I'm also going to pass this around. If you want to leave your email, I'll send you some resources, or if you want to take my email down to send a question. And this can be used for people, and I'll get back up here.
Judy, we have enough microphones.
Oh, you have enough microphones. Oh.
We have one on each side.
I didn't realize that. Okay.
Hi, thank you for the presentation and welcome to Armenia. My name is Rubina. I want to ask a question about HPV vaccine. So it was mentioned that it is transferred through a skin-to-skin contact. So yes. So if, let's say, the female is a virgin and she's going to have intercourse for the first time, is there a way to figure out if the male has that virus through some tests?
There are ways. There are HPV tests. I don't think they're widely available here, but there are tests for HPV.
Judy, they are available here as well.
They are available. Okay. The problem is that it isn't just HPV. That's so prevalent. But there are other sexually transmissible infections. There's chlamydia. There's gonorrhea. We have to worry about HIV too. It's very important that women think about barrier protection. That even if you're married, you have to look into this. There's a study by the Armenian health minister from years ago. I don't know what it is right now, but I met him many years ago, and he said male promiscuity in this culture is pretty high, and that there's a fairly significant use of prostitutes. He said what happens is the men go home and infect their wives, and the women have no idea. Now, I don't know how prevalent a problem that is now, but that was something that was tracked by the World Health Organization. They even had it in a report some years ago. I do not know how much public education has been successful in we have this problem in the United States too, in encouraging young women and men to remember to use condoms, female condoms and male condoms. Sometimes men don't like to use male condoms, but you get a fair amount of good protection with a female condom. It's not complete, but it's pretty good because it certainly protects the outside area of the vulva. That is something that women have to remember, that there are other ways to get infected. And it isn't just pregnancy. Sometimes people think all I need is a contraception and I won't get pregnant. But you have to think about your overall reproductive health. And you have to think whenever you have sex with somebody else and you might get pregnant, you also might get an STI. So I think that one of the things we do need are more things like this booklet. And I'll leave this here for you to look at. I have to take it back with me. Dr. Mary Hachikian's organization, which is based at St. Mary's Health Center, has lots of good resources. And they produced that book here, which is it's one of the things I will send you if you put your email down. It's a 4-megabyte file. The whole book you can have electronically. It's a little bit outdated because they did this some years back. I think it came out in 2005, so it doesn't have a lot of recent information. But we are hoping that more of the recent information that is out there, both at our website and other websites, will be in Armenian very soon. There's a group based in Germany called Clue. How many of you know about Clue? And the website, and they've got it, it's created for apps as well. Hello Clue. They have 50 million users around the world, and they have materials in all kinds of languages. They started out with a focus on menstruation, and now they're expanding, and we're working with them to get evidence-based content that's available at their website. They have a lot of venture capital money there right now, and they're being very careful about not using inappropriate advertising, so that we could see this kind of information in other languages. They would probably host information in Armenian and make it widely available if we could produce the information. And I know you have enormous skills right here at AUA and in the country to translate things, even medical materials, and check with back translations to make sure it's accuracy, that we could maybe collaboratively produce good information that would be in Armenian, and then use social media to make sure everybody reads it.
Well, thank you very much. And my second and last question, do you know what is the efficiency of the HPV vaccine in percentages or other measurements?
Oh, it's very, very effective. I mean, it's completely effective with the 4 types now, the 9 types, the 2 types. So you're going to get 90+% protection. The trouble is that it's not going to address all the types of HPV that might lead to cervical cancer. As I said, about 13 of them do, and we're only dealing with 1 now. That Gardasil 9 addresses 9 of them. Every single part of the world has a different profile in terms of what percentage of the cervical cancers are caused by this type of HPV, this type of HPV. That it's different in different countries. And it's one of the things the World Health Organization is looking at. I don't think people should be hysterical about HPV. And they shouldn't be hysterical about the vaccine. It is true that any vaccine has what we call negative consequences for a tiny number of users. Remember the bell-shaped curve like this. So you have outliers in the bell-shaped curve. And some of them are made ill by the vaccine. That is why you don't necessarily make a mandate for a vaccine. I'm not in favor of mandates for HPV. I'm in favor of making it available and making sort of young people understand that it's important to get it before you're going to be sexually active if you want to use it. Small numbers will have negative health consequences. That's true for any vaccine. It's not necessarily a reason not to use it, particularly if you are someone who's sexually active. Particularly if you're not in a monogamous relationship where you know you're both monogamous, you are at significant risk. You have to think about your own particular situation.
Just with any medication has certain side effects. Even
Absolutely.
The ones that we use every day for headache or anything.
That's right.
Just
Every medication, exactly. I mean, the principal investigator for the trial of 25,000 women in the first Merck trials over the last, well, now looking maybe 15, 18 years, a woman named Dr. Cosette Wheeler, who's based at the University of New Mexico. She is so proud of this accomplishment. And she's the first to say, you know, I think it is something that most young women would want, most parents would probably want for their children. But she's the first to say it's not something that should be mandated. We do not need herd immunity the way we need for other issues, and we've got to educate the public about its value, and particularly because it is so closely intertwined with the sexuality conversation. She was so sensitive to introducing it in a way that wouldn't produce a backlash, and that's, you know, we dealt with this in the United States, and I can see it's lots of misinformation. It's very similar to the misinformation you see in Armenia about gender equality or recognizing the rights of lesbians or gay people or transgender people in this country. There's this fear that somehow the fabric of the Armenian family will be destroyed if we accept people in all the ways that they emerge. People do not choose to be homosexual. We know that now. There's good science here. People are sometimes homosexual. Their sexual orientation, gender identity might not even be the same thing in the same person over the period of their lifetime. There is some fluidity here. But we have to recognize that people are who they are. Accepting them, recognizing their rights doesn't threaten our families or the values that we may hold. I have friends who were upset that their child turned out to be gay. But the vast majority of them came around to accepting them, and some of them married a gay person, and they had children, and they're very happy grandparents now. It was a hard transition, but they didn't want to destroy their family and reject their own child in the end simply because the child turned out to be gay. That was not a choice. That was who the person was. And the people I know who didn't want to have any contact with their gay children 10, 15 years later, they're very unhappy people. I think you really need to resolve this kind of dissonance within a family if you want to have harmony and you want to keep the family positive in a way that we all hopefully desire. Yes?
Hello, thanks for the interesting presentation. I have a question. You said about the importance of educating the general population about HPV and its vaccine. So what if we have a problem when physicians, and what is even worse, gynecologists are against the vaccine, and when they are the role models for the general population and they recommend them to not take the vaccine? How can we deal with that problem?
You introduced a very important problem. That was the reason we did this book in 1970. And that is that physicians are often not well informed about very important topics. That was true in our country around so many issues. What do? You have to organize among yourselves, speak directly to people, send them to the medical information you can now get online. When we started, there was no easily available website. There wasn't even the internet then. Now you have that information from well-established medical bodies around the world. Learn what they are. Take the information to your physician. Sometimes they're resistant, sometimes they welcome it. And tell them, you know, you're giving wrong information. This is a myth. The truth is here. Tell other people who see that physician. I can't tell you how many physicians told women years ago, oh, why don't you just bottle feed your baby with infant formula? It's better than using breast milk. Well, that's totally untrue. And we now have so much data that points out how untrue that is. But many of the obstetricians were telling women years ago, oh, don't bother with breastfeeding. It's not important. Of course, we know it's important. This is a problem that won't be immediately be resolved by physicians. We have learned over the years that sometimes physicians are the slowest to change in their practices. They were removing women's uteruses in the United States. Thousands and thousands of women lost their uterus unnecessarily until we had a big campaign going have a good medical reason. I won't get into it now. But it was only by reaching women directly and Oprah had a whole magazine article on this because of the problem. She saw too that so many women were having unnecessary surgery, and the doctors thinking, it's just a useless organ, get rid of it. You're in your late 40s, 50s. Well, actually, it plays a role even after you're done with your childbearing. So this kind of problem exists almost in every area. So you have to be ready to challenge your doctor. It's not easy. To be very polite, because they don't like being challenged by lay persons, people who are not medical professionals. Sometimes you can take something off the internet. There are some good materials printed out. Just leave it in the office. Share it with other people who use that doctor. That's how we actually got doctors to change. We publicized information, and the doctors had to change because women wouldn't go to them anymore because they weren't giving out good information. So this is going to be a struggle, I know, but eventually, most doctors, I think, will come around and stop saying that the HPV vaccine is terribly dangerous, or whatever they're saying. I don't know what they're saying, but it's not terribly dangerous.
Thanks a lot.
As Dr. said, almost every drug you take has a potential downside, some of the effects being quite negative. Yes?
Hello, my name is Susanna. I'm MPH alumna. Thank you for presentation. First of all, I would like to mention that all you said has very deep roots, and we have to change first the culture of patient-physician relationship in Armenia. We do not have a culture of discussion between patient and physician. Physicians are very often very resistant and do not take into account the opinion, and even you come to them with the proof, with the evidence-based literature, they would become very angry, and so the talk will not be very happy for the patient. So first of all, should all work towards this, to change the culture of this relationship. My question is regarding the one type of violence against the women, and I would like to hear if you have this topic on your agenda. It's about sex-selective abortions. It's a huge topic here in Armenia, and government and many international organizations are working to solve this. So I want to hear about your experience with these topics, and what would any cases interesting or any experience benchmarks in this area. Thank you.
Sure. First, let me do the second one. One of the forms of violence against women, which you're saying is sex selection. So Armenia happens to be, in terms of per capita, in the top 3 countries that practice sex selection. The other 2 are China and Azerbaijan. India used to be in this group, and certainly more sex selection happens there, but in terms of per capita, I think it's 4th now. The preference for male children is a problem, and it's produced an imbalance. So you'll see that there are more men than women. If this were to continue, it'd be very problematic. The desire to ban the practice is not a good idea. It should never be banned. We need to educate the public. The devaluing of female children is a problem in many cultures. Ironically, in Armenia, women are not devalued as much as they are in other cultures. There's a lot of respect in many, many communities for Armenian women, what they offer, how smart they are. They are participants in the community, particularly in the urban areas. Armenian women are becoming more and more prominent. The problem of violence against women is huge, and that's why the Women's Support Center, the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women, which has got 10 groups in it now, so important. We're having a vigil at 7 o'clock between the 2 statues by the Opera House on Monday night at 7 o'clock. Please join us. The Coalition is putting this on, and we'll all have candle candles. My partner Craig Norberg-Bohm, who's sitting back there, Craig did a presentation here yesterday addressing the importance of engaging men in preventing violence. Not all men are perpetrators. I think the statistics show something between 20 to 25% in Armenia. But what about all the other men who are not perpetrators? Are they doing something to make the climate less conducive to male violence against women? What can they do? What can we do to integrate more bystander intervention programs, fatherhood programs where men are seen as being valued as nurturing parents, taking care of the babies, of the children, and that being seen as a valuable contribution to society, not just women's work. That, I think, is going to take time. It's certainly taking time everywhere else in the world where women are trying to engage in family work balance with their partners. And in more countries, women and men who are married are trying to both have work outside the home, sometimes part-time work, so that both can be extremely, mainly involved with the upbringing of their children. I think this is an important trend. And one way, of course, you promote it is by giving parental leave, paid parental leave, which almost all the European countries do. The United States allows unpaid family leave by law for the first 12 weeks. We have nothing like what you see in Europe. And some other countries are like the United States, but increasingly countries are trying to support families. France, Sweden, they have very good parental leave. And I don't know what the situation is here. Do you know?
We have paid leave for mothers, but not for fathers. And it's...
4 years unpaid.
Hmm?
We have 3 years.
Up to 3 years, you can keep your job. It's an unpaid.
For the father?
No, for the mother.
Oh, it's unpaid.
We do not have.
Oh.
For 3 years is unpaid, but for the first 70 days after the birth, it's a paid leave.
Well, that would be a good thing to give men, because I have met a few families where the primary breadwinner is the mother and not the father. So what they would like is to have the father to be able to take off and be the primary, if it can work out that way. You also have to think about the fact that many women want to breastfeed even when they're working, so you have to have a refrigerator if you're going to pump milk, and it's not so simple if you're away from your baby all day after, you need a little bit of time to make sure the breast milk is coming in, but being able to pump your breast milk and store it and then make it available for your partner or someone else to feed the baby is very important. But let me get to the other issue, which is sex selection, finishing this up. One of the best books about this is a book called Unnatural Selection by Myra Hvistendahl, Hvistendahl. I believe she may have even come to Armenia some years ago. She studied this issue in depth, has a lot of information about Armenia in her book. She was a UPI journalist for many years. I think that stopping this excessive practice of sex selection is not going to be easy. And I don't have ideas about the best strategies to use in this country, but I do think it's worth having meetings that are open, where we talk more openly about it. I mean, in fact, one of the conversations I had with a few people before is next time, maybe AWA does an event here in Armenia with some other activists, we could maybe host a conversation about some of the issues that women here see as their primary issues, and how could support from women who live outside Armenia be directed towards helping those causes. AWA does support some good causes here, but there's room for improvement, I'm sure. Any other comments or questions? Did I finish everything? I can't remember what your other question was. Okay. Yes, okay. Then we're going to be here for a few minutes. If you want to give us your email or take some of the materials here, there's a card with the Facebook and the website for Our Bodies, Ourselves, and information about Surrogacy 360. You can look at the books that are here at the AUA library. And we look forward to staying in touch with you all. Thank you for coming.